Hey everyone, I'm coming to you today with 10 songwriting, mixing, and production tips for DIY musicians. These are things that have helped me in my creative pursuits over the years, things that I wish someone had told me about when I was first getting started, but ended up learning on my own as I went. I don't expect that all of these will apply to you in the music that you're making, but even if just one of these tips resonates with you and helps you out, then I'll sleep better at night. And by the way, these are not too technical. They're more about process, approach, and mindset. I'm not going to get into the weeds about EQ and compression and stuff like that. There are plenty of other people out there who cover that way better than I could. Also keep in mind that I'm not a professional, my mixes aren't perfect, but I don't think that's the fault of my process. I'm always improving in these areas and I still feel very productive and creatively fulfilled. So I think anyone, regardless of how good or experienced they are, could find some of these ideas helpful. And if you do find these tips helpful, please be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. Tip number 1, pursue every idea. Not every song is going to be your best song. But you won't find your best song if you reject ideas before you explore them and give them an opportunity to become their best. Some of the best songs have very basic, humble beginnings. Let each song have a life and then cut them later if you don't like how they landed. Example, one of my favorite bands is Queens of the Stone Age, and they have several songs where Josh Homme is just hammering out the same 8th note power chord for 90% of a verse. And those songs are still great. Every idea has potential, it's up to you to make something great out of it. No ideas are inherently bad, sometimes they're just not taken in the best direction. Don't discount a song before it's even at the 25% mark yet. Another great and more specific example of this is Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes. Be honest, if your bass player came to band practice and said, "Hey, I wrote this cool riff, bum, 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 bum," you'd be like, "How about no?" But Jack White saw potential in it. He pursued the idea. He developed it in the right way, realizing that his snarly blues punk vocal style would be a good complement to it. And what do you know? It became one of the most well-known songs of the last 25 years, I would argue. It wouldn't have happened if he had thrown it away just based on that riff. Tip number 2, ride the waves of inspiration. It's important to know when you should push yourself to do something maybe you don't want to do, and when to follow your gut and avoid something that just doesn't sound interesting or fun to you. We all do our best creative work when we're inspired and motivated, so follow that. There is a balance you have to strike though, and it's something you need to be intentional about. Otherwise you'll end up at one of the following extremes. One extreme are the people who overwork themselves and do their craft, do their thing all the time even when they don't want to. These are the people who burn themselves out, end up hating what they're doing, and stop altogether. I think we've all known someone like that. If you end up hating the time you spend on your music, or whatever your creative pursuit is, more than you enjoy it, then why are you doing it? It should be fun. But the other extreme is never starting anything at all because you can't push yourself to get that momentum going. Maybe you're afraid of failure, or what you come up with never feels good enough. The thing you have to realize is that everyone has those feelings in the beginning. It's a matter of whether you push through them or not. And I'm not judging. If it sounds like work to you and you'd rather spend your time doing something else, then do something else. But the point is, if you're going to create something, the process itself should be fun and entertaining to you. And if it's not, don't do it because you're only going to make yourself miserable. I have a lot of songs that are 25 to 80% done that I've kind of just left where they are because I wasn't feeling them. You're not going to make a song the best it can be if you force yourself to work on it when you don't want to and you're not feeling it. Maybe you'll come back to it, maybe you won't. Who cares? That's where tip number 1 comes in, pursue every idea. If you keep pursuing all the ideas you come up with, it won't matter if you put some in the icebox for later because you'll always have fresh inspiration. Maybe someday you'll revisit those archived songs and they'll feel fresh to you. It happens to me all the time. I have some other examples of this in my life right now. I haven't been very motivated to do cover videos lately. I did a lot of them over the last 4 to 6 months. A while back I finished my Karma Police cover, and I may take a break from them until it feels exciting again. My wife and I just got a new house and it needs a lot of work. I've been writing songs over there that I'm really excited about, and I've also been enjoying making these more conversational videos. So that's what I'm doing. I could push myself to make more cover videos right now that I don't want to make, and I wouldn't have any fun with it In my heart, it wouldn't feel like the right use of my time, and I would end up burning myself out, and then it would take me even longer to pick up the cover videos again because I would have that sour taste from them. Go where your interests and your motivation leads you. That's where you're happiest and where you'll do your best work. Like I said though, it's a balance. One example of where I do force myself to do things I don't necessarily want to do is practicing for shows. I have a very strict practice regimen when I have a show coming up, and sometimes I will force myself to practice my set even when I don't want to, because I know that's what it will take to put on a good show. It doesn't ruin the fun for me though, and if I ever felt like it was, I'd probably slow down and focus my energy on something else for a while, like writing or producing. Put your time and energy into where you feel inspired. That is how you'll do your best work. Tip number 3, know your strengths and limitations. And not only be aware of them, but be intentional about how you're expanding your strengths and working within your limitations while still pushing yourself in the right ways. Here's what I mean. A while back, I saw a clip of a Steve Vai interview where he said something along the lines of, "I never worked on my weaknesses." Instead, he leaned into his strengths and cultivated and exaggerated those strengths to develop his unique sound and get really good at the things that he had a natural aptitude for. Now, I don't agree with this 100%. I think there's a lot to be said for getting good at something that you're not naturally good at. It teaches discipline and can sometimes benefit you in other areas that you might not have expected. The only thing that I picked up relatively easily when it comes to music is bass guitar. It's my first instrument, it's my primary musical language, so to speak, and I've been working hard for many years to get better at other things like singing and playing drums and piano and so on. But honestly, my starting point for those other instruments were not great. And maybe that's why I'm not more successful. But I found that to be incredibly rewarding, and it helps me to fulfill my creative visions. Getting better at drums and piano and guitar has made me a better bass player though too. But I think the larger point that Steve Vai was trying to make is to just be yourself. Everyone is naturally good at something. Everyone is unique, and you'll have a better time embracing that and capitalizing on it than to try hard being someone you're not and spend so much time on something that doesn't come naturally to you. So for that reason, it's important to lean into what makes you unique, because you can't be anyone else. You can only be you. The world doesn't need another George Clinton, Bjork, Janelle Monáe, or Tom York. It already has one of each of them. You can be influenced by them, but you have to figure out what makes you, you. And you don't have to be the best. Best doesn't matter in music. That's the beauty of it. I will never be as good a songwriter as Paul McCartney, Stevie Wonder, Kate Bush, Joni Mitchell, just to name a few of my favorites. I can't write the songs that they write. But that doesn't matter, because they can't write the songs that I write. And they can't write the songs that you write. And I can't write the songs that you write. And even if my songs aren't as good as theirs, and your songs aren't as good as theirs, they still deserve to have a life and reach the people that might get something out of them. That's why this is so important. If you're not giving the world something that is authentically you, then you're depriving it of something it will never get anywhere else. But sometimes figuring yourself out and understanding your own strengths and limitations to get there is a process. Developing that self-awareness can be hard, but it's worth doing. I talked in the last tip about my strict practice regimen when I have a show coming up, but when I don't have a show coming up, I really don't practice much. I'm not the kind of person who picks up a guitar just to play, just to dink around. I never do that. I need to have some kind of goal that I'm working toward that pushes me to pick up an instrument. And honestly, that's something I don't really like about myself. I wish I felt that urge more compulsively. It would probably make me better. But if I forced myself to, I would eventually start to hate playing because that's not what I want to do. It's not how I enjoy music. So instead of trying to change that about myself, I accepted it and found ways to keep myself playing, like writing and recording a lot of original material, playing shows, making cover videos, playing in various bands with my friends. There are certain things you will not be able to change about yourself, and that's okay. For those things, it becomes more about navigating the obstacles rather than changing yourself. I found a way to make that work for me. Another more personal example is I get really bad anxiety leading up to performances. And I found many years ago that that anxiety gets worse if I eat within like 4 or 5 hours before a show. So I don't eat before shows. I still get nervous, but not eating helps. Pay attention to the signals that your body and mind are giving you, and instead of beating yourself up about those limitations or struggles, learn how to navigate them. Tip number 4, dictate your process, not the expected output. For this tip, I want to make a comparison to literature or storytelling. Think of these two types of writing, character-driven and plot-driven. In more plot-driven writing, you have a story you want to follow, you have an end already in mind, and you push your characters along that path in kind of a forceful way so that the actions or events that you want to see happen. In more character-driven writing, you define the characters more so than the plot and ask yourself, what would this character do next, based on what I know about them and how I designed them? And then they take the story places you otherwise may not have thought to take it. When it comes to your music, I recommend doing the latter. And the way that translates to music for me is to let yourself be the character in the story, and instead of prescribing yourself with an end point, define a process and see where it takes you. Focus on your inputs rather than your outputs, basically. Now, it can be fun sometimes to give yourself a really specific task, like, I want to make a song that's in this very specific genre or has this specific sound. But sometimes those kinds of goals can be hard to achieve, and you end up disliking the outcome, not because it's bad, but simply because it's not what you expected, because it's not what you set out to do. And the expectations we set with ourselves are everything. For example, several years ago, I was thinking about the prog rock and post-rock bands I love, like Rush, King Crimson, Godspeed You Black Emperor, and others, and thought about how amazing it is that they can put out these 5 or 6 track albums that still feel so complete. And I asked myself, I wonder what a Tom Hummer album with only 5 tracks would sound like. So I did that, and the result was my album Dystopian Blues, which of the music I've made is probably one of my personal favorites because I went into it with no expectation of how it would sound, but I gave myself some direction, dictated a process, and worked within some guardrails that kept me moving but left me open to more ideas. It's by far the most fun I've had making a solo album. If you get tunnel vision on a very specific end goal, you miss out on a lot of inspiration that may come along the way, and you're more likely to end up disappointed. Number 5, get the initial ideas out quickly and then iterate over time, also known as the 80-20 rule. Record your main tracks as quickly as possible and then work iteratively on mixing and production in like 15 to 45 minute bursts. Basically, get 80% of the work done in 20% of the time and then spend the other 80% of your time polishing up that remaining 20% of the song. To make another literature reference, there's an old adage that you should write fast and edit slow. I think it's the same with music. Recording your main tracks quickly tends to bring more cohesion. The song is fresh in your mind and you're excited about it, you're in that honeymoon phase with it. Remember what I just said about riding the wave of inspiration a little while back? Ride that wave until you feel like you have the foundation solidified for the song, and then you can always embellish later or re-record a part if you don't like it anymore. For me, working on a song that's mostly done for longer than 30 or 40 minutes at a time starts to be counterproductive. You end up undoing something that you just did 30 minutes ago. You turn a track down and then turn it back up and then turn it back down again, and it just wastes time. Make the quick changes that are obvious to your ears in that moment, then move on to another song. Come back the next day and do the same thing. Make the tweaks that are obvious, and eventually you'll just run out of things to adjust. For me, when it comes to mixing and production, working on a song for 5 hours spread across the span of a week is way more productive than working on a song for 5 hours in one day. When you revisit a song the next day, your ears are fresh. Your first 15 minutes working on it will be the most productive, and you'll be making smarter decisions for the song. Get to a good stopping point, stop, and pick it up again later. Of course, there are exceptions to this. I advocate for giving your songs and yourself breathing room and taking time to develop them, but then again, some of the best albums have been recorded in very short spans of time. Tip number 6, define done. You could work on any song forever, but that defeats the purpose because then no one will ever hear it. Decide for yourself what done looks or sounds like, and don't let yourself work on something forever. For me, a song is done when I go 2 listens in a row on different days without adjusting anything. Sometimes I find it's best to leave a few days or even a week between those 2 final listens. Give yourself time to forget about the song a bit, and not be so emotionally invested in it. You'll hear it more clearly and objectively and make smarter decisions for it that way. It's also easy to fall into the trap of adding and adding to a mix until it's too much. But if you feel like something's missing and the tracks you have are just not coming together for you, then maybe there is something missing. In a lot of music, especially rock and pop music, there are usually several extra layers added to recordings that you don't necessarily notice unless you're paying very close attention, but you would definitely notice if they weren't there. If your mix is feeling weak, you may just need one or two of these supporting layers. For me, the most common ones that I find really help fill out a song are auxiliary percussion like a shaker or tambourine, a light synth layer underneath the mix to add atmosphere and fill out any gaps in the stereo image, additional vocal layers, and additional guitar layers. Especially with vocal layers, harmonies are everything. We hear them all the time in music and we hardly notice it, but they are so crucial. I can't stress that enough. Once again though, these don't apply to all situations. If you're making a stripped down rock is punk album, for example, then let that be what it is. But if you keep listening to your mix over and over again and feel like it's just not as full as you want it to be, considering adding one of those things. Tip number 7. Equipment is important, but not more important than your performance. I'm embarrassed to say this, but I just really started getting more into gear over the last few years. And what do you know? My mixes are much better for it. But no matter how good your equipment is, your mix won't sound tight and punchy if the drums, guitar, and bass hits aren't aligned with each other like they should be. If your music doesn't include guitar, bass, and drums, if you're playing other kinds of music, still important for things to align. I mean, it amazed me how much better my mixes sounded as I started upgrading my guitars, my microphones, and my drum kit, but if you're recording on the best equipment in the world and you play sloppy, then the quality of the equipment ceases to matter. It's so easy to get lost in EQs and compressors and whatnot, and the mix still doesn't sound right because in the end, maybe you just didn't sing the song with the right inflection or intensity, or you were playing upstrokes on your guitar when you should have been playing downstrokes. These things matter significantly. So, be discerning. Listen closely when something sounds off and ask yourself, do I need new, better equipment to make this sound the way I want? Or is there something I could do differently in the performance to make it sound better? Great musicians can make nearly any instrument sound good. I've heard stories about how Jeff Beck could take a crappy guitar and amp and find exactly the right way to play it to make it sound incredible. Similarly, on Keith Jarrett's Colne Concert album, there was a mix-up and the wrong piano was used, one that was only intended for practice. The tuning wasn't right on the piano, the pedals didn't work, and yet Keith still found a way to roll with it and adjusted his performance to fit the sound of the instrument. The resulting album became the best-selling solo jazz album of all time. My point is, great musicians can make subpar equipment sound good, and subpar musicians can make great equipment sound bad. Anyone who's listened to a mediocre player on a $2,000 guitar at Guitar Center knows that. Put more time into improving your playing than on buying better equipment. You can't buy chops. It only comes with practice. Tip number 8, know your monitors or speakers. Obviously, better equipment is always better, but it's not always necessary. There's a point of diminishing return with how much money you're putting into your equipment and how marginally better it will make you sound. And I would say the same thing goes for your studio monitors. What's more important than anything is just getting to know how they make things sound. Listen to songs that you already know and like on your monitors to calibrate your ears to them, and then get your songs to match those that have a production style similar to what you're going for. My monitors, for example, are a little bass heavy. I've adjusted them as much as I can, but in general, I just know how to expect things will sound from them. Be aware of your biases and try to be objective though. When you listen to your favorite song on computer or phone speakers, you don't think about how crappy it sounds because it's your favorite song, and you know how it should sound. Your brain fills in the gaps and gives it the benefit of the doubt. But we don't tend to give that same benefit of the doubt to our own music. We have trouble hearing it objectively. So don't expect your song to sound any better on crappy speakers than music you already know and love. Expect it to sound similar. The goal there is for it to sound crappy in the same ways so that it's clearly the speaker's fault and not your fault. Also, be mindful of the software you're using. This wasn't as much of a problem 15 to 20 years ago because everyone was just burning CDs. You put your favorite CD into a CD player, listen to some of it, and then swap it out with a burned CD of your album made from WAV formatted files, and that way you're comparing apples to apples because the format and the hardware is the same. But today, if I stream a song for comparison on Spotify or YouTube and then bring up my song as a WAV file in a generic media player on my phone or computer, the file format may not be the same, and the output level of those softwares may not be the same. I even noticed that when I upload the same video to Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, and watch them all on my computer, the volume will be a little bit different between all of them. You need to eliminate as many of these variables as possible to ensure you're making an accurate and fair comparison. Tip number 9, use various listening modes. You never truly hear the same song twice. The source, the device, the speakers, your environment, the air density, the earwax in your ears, all these things color and shape the sound. The goal is not to make it sound the same in all environments despite these variables, because that's a losing battle. The goal is to make it sound good in all these environments. You want to minimize the amount that people are saying, oh, this sounds way different on this system because of this. You want people to not notice those differences, or at least get your mixes to a point where listeners will attribute those discrepancies to the system and not to your work. This isn't just about listening on different systems, though. It's also about listening in different ways on the same system. For example, I always listen to everything at 3 different distances on my monitors. First is the close listen, which is within about 1 foot of the speakers. Then is the medium listen, which is about 3 feet from the speakers. Last is the far listen, which is about 8 feet away or more, doesn't matter. For this one, just give the song space to bounce around the room. Listen to it like people will listen to it when it's just playing in the room that they're in. You'll find that in each of these distances, the mix sounds slightly different. And that's fine. That's just physics. Don't expect them all to sound the same. Just try to make them all sound good. What about listening through headphones? This is valuable, and you should always do it, but I don't recommend making major mixing or production decisions based on headphones unless it sounds really bad on headphones. You mainly want to check these just to make sure it doesn't sound off. Of course, there are exceptions. People have done a lot of creative stuff specifically with headphone mixing. Also, be sure to listen in a car or other systems. If you don't have a car, get an Uber or a Lyft and ride around and make the driver listen to the song with you and get their opinion on it. Listen at different volumes too. Soft, medium, loud. Pay attention to what parts of your mix pop out differently at these volumes. What about mono mixes? I usually don't bother with mono mixes, but some people like to. Old mono mixes were usually done completely separately from the stereo mixes, so personally I wouldn't expect a mono mix to automatically sound good if you intended for your music to be listened to in stereo. Some folks may disagree with that though. And finally, tip number 10, share with your friends. The moment you hit play on your song for the first time when someone is in the room with you, you will hear it differently. It can be really painful, but it's necessary. You'll also hopefully get some helpful feedback from your friend, but of course, take that with a grain of salt. Be judicious about what suggested changes you want to make, and be critical about if they fit your vision for the song. But at the same time, be open to suggestions. Also, be sure to share your music with people whose biases, preferences, and musical backgrounds you understand. Share it with some friends who are musicians. Share it with some friends who aren't musicians and are just casual listeners. They will have different kinds of feedback that will all be valuable to you in different ways. And that's it. Let me know which of these tips you found helpful. Let me know which ones you might disagree with. Let me know what tips you found that you think would contribute well to this conversation. And also, if you haven't, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd really appreciate that. Now, get out and make some music!